For years, I lost sleep almost every single time something difficult happened with one of my adult children. A tense phone call, a hurtful comment, a request I did not know how to answer, a piece of bad news I could not immediately fix. My mind would spin through these situations for hours, sometimes for days, robbing me of rest I desperately needed at my age. Then I discovered a single, simple practice that changed everything. I call it the 3-day rule, and I want to share it with you today, because I believe it may save your sanity the way it saved mine. My dear friends, I want to be honest with you from the very beginning. This rule did not come to me through some grand insight or years of careful study. It came from sheer exhaustion, from finally reaching a point where I simply could not continue reacting to every difficult moment with my adult children the way I always had, immediately, emotionally, and at enormous cost to my own peace and rest. What I discovered, almost by accident, has become one of the most valuable practices of my later years, and I want to walk you through exactly what it is, how it works, and how it can protect your own sleep and sanity as well. The nights I could not sleep, I want to describe honestly what my nights looked like for many years, because I believe many of you will recognize this pattern in your own lives. Whenever something difficult happened involving one of my 3 children, a disagreement, a hurtful word said in frustration, a difficult request for money or support, an unexpected piece of concerning news, I would find myself lying awake that same night, sometimes for hours, replaying the situation over and over in my mind. I would compose responses I never actually sent. I would imagine confrontations that never actually occurred. I would calculate and recalculate financial requests long after the conversation had ended. I would lie in the darkness, my heart racing, my mind refusing to settle, consumed entirely by whatever difficulty had arisen earlier that day. This pattern was not occasional. It was, for many years, simply how I responded to nearly any significant difficulty involving my children, regardless of how large or small that difficulty actually was. I want to be honest about the cost of this pattern. My sleep suffered enormously, night after night, year after year. My physician expressed genuine concern about the toll this chronic sleep disruption was taking on my overall health. And beyond the physical cost, I began to notice that my immediate, emotional reactions to difficult situations with my children were often making those situations worse rather than better. Reacting immediately, while still consumed by hurt, worry, or frustration, rarely produced the thoughtful, measured response I actually wanted to offer. The night everything changed, I want to share with you the specific night that led to the discovery of this rule, because I believe the story itself illustrates why this practice works so effectively. My son and I had a significant disagreement during a phone call, one that ended with some genuinely hurtful words exchanged on both sides. I hung up the phone deeply upset, and true to my old pattern, I found myself unable to sleep that night, my mind replaying the conversation over and over, composing angry responses, rehearsing hurt feelings, considering whether I should call him back immediately to address what had happened. At some point during that sleepless night, exhausted and genuinely at the end of my ability to continue this pattern, I made a decision almost out of sheer desperation. I decided that I would not respond to this situation at all, not that night, not the next day, but that I would wait a full 3 days before deciding how, or even whether, to address what had happened. I did not know, at that moment, whether this would actually help. I simply knew that I could not continue the exhausting cycle of immediate emotional reaction that had characterized my response to difficult situations for as long as I could remember. What happened over those 3 days surprised me significantly, and it became the foundation for a practice I have followed consistently ever since. What the 3-day rule actually is, let me explain clearly what this rule involves, because I want you to understand it precisely enough to apply it in your own life. The 3-day rule is simple. Whenever something difficult occurs involving one of my adult children, whether a hurtful conversation, a significant request, concerning news, or any situation that produces strong emotional reaction within me, I commit to waiting a full 3 days before taking any significant action or making any significant decision in response. During these 3 days, I do not ignore the situation entirely, and I do not pretend it did not happen. I simply refuse to allow myself to react immediately, while my emotions are still running high and my judgment, understandably, is not yet operating with full clarity. I allow the situation to exist, unaddressed in any dramatic sense, for those 3 days, giving both my own emotions and the situation itself time to settle before I decide how to respond. I want to be clear that this is not about avoidance or suppression. It is about creating deliberate space between the initial emotional reaction and my eventual response, space that allows genuine clarity to develop rather than allowing my immediate, often exaggerated emotional state to dictate decisions that may have lasting consequences for my relationships and my own peace of mind. Why 3 days specifically? I want to explain why I settled on 3 days specifically, rather than a shorter or longer period, because I believe the reasoning matters. In my own experience, and in observing this pattern over many years now, I discovered that the first 24 hours after a difficult situation are almost always dominated by raw, unprocessed emotion. Anger, hurt, worry, or fear tend to be at their most intense during this initial period, and any response formed during these first hours tends to reflect this raw emotional intensity rather than genuine clarity. By the second day, I noticed that the intensity of my initial emotional reaction typically begins to soften somewhat, though it has not yet fully settled into genuine clarity. This second day often becomes a period of continued processing, sometimes involving some remaining agitation, but generally less intense than the first 24 hours. By the third day, I discovered consistently, something remarkable tends to happen. My initial emotional reaction has generally settled enough that I can consider the situation with genuine clarity, weighing what actually matters, what genuinely requires a response, and what specific response would actually serve the relationship and my own peace, rather than simply venting whatever raw emotion I experienced during that first difficult night. I want to be honest that this timeline reflects my own experience and may vary somewhat for different people and different situations, but I have found, consistently, that 3 days provide sufficient space for genuine clarity to develop, without allowing so much time to pass that addressing a genuinely important matter becomes unnecessarily delayed or entirely avoided. How this rule applied to that first difficult conversation let me return to the situation with my son that first led me to discover this practice, because I believe walking through exactly what happened will help illustrate how this rule works in real circumstances. On that first sleepless night, my mind was consumed with hurt and anger about what he had said during our disagreement. I wanted, desperately, to call him back immediately and address every hurtful word directly, defending my own position and demanding he acknowledge how he had wronged me. I did not make that call. I held to my new commitment, uncomfortable as it felt, and allowed the first day to pass without taking any action. I want to be honest, that first day was difficult. I continued to feel considerable hurt and frustration, and I found myself, at various points throughout the day, drafting mental responses I still wanted to deliver. By the second day, something had begun to shift. My hurt feelings remained, but the intensity had softened somewhat, and I found myself, for the first time since our conversation, actually considering his perspective alongside my own. I began to recall that he had been under significant stress at work during that period, stress he had mentioned briefly during our call before the disagreement escalated. This context, which I had been too emotionally reactive to properly consider during that first difficult night, began to soften my understanding of what had actually happened between us. By the third day, I felt genuinely ready to address the situation, and importantly, I felt ready to address it with actual clarity rather than raw emotional reaction. I called my son, and rather than opening with the defensive, accusatory approach I had rehearsed during that first sleepless night, I found myself able to say simply, calmly, that our conversation a few days earlier had hurt me, and I wanted to understand what had been going on for him during that call. This calm, measured approach, made possible only by the 3 days of space I had allowed myself, led to a genuinely productive conversation, one that repaired our relationship rather than deepening the conflict, as an immediate, emotionally reactive response likely would have done. Applying the rule to financial requests, I want to walk you through how this same rule applies to a different type of difficulty, financial requests from adult children, which I know many of you struggle with as much as I once did. In the past, when one of my children called with an urgent financial request, I would typically respond immediately, either agreeing right away out of guilt and a desire to avoid conflict, or occasionally refusing abruptly out of frustration built up from previous requests, neither response reflecting genuine, thoughtful consideration. Now, when a financial request arises, I apply the same 3-day principle. I tell my child directly, calmly, that I want to consider their request thoughtfully before responding, and that I will give them my answer within a few days. This simple pause, I have discovered, transforms the entire dynamic of these conversations. Rather than reacting immediately from guilt or frustration, I am able to genuinely consider my own financial circumstances, the actual nature and urgency of their request, and what response would genuinely serve both my own security and their long-term well-being. I have noticed, interestingly, that this practice has also changed how my children approach these requests. Knowing that I will consider their request thoughtfully rather than reacting immediately seems to have encouraged them to present their requests more thoughtfully as well, with clearer explanations and more realistic expectations, rather than relying on the urgency of the moment to produce an immediate, less considered response from me. Applying the rule to concerning news, this practice has also transformed how I respond to concerning news about my children's lives, situations involving their health, their marriages, their careers, or other significant difficulties. In the past, concerning news would trigger immediate anxious action on my part, urgent phone calls, unsolicited advice offered before I had genuinely understood the full situation, anxious insertion of myself into circumstances that were not always mine to resolve. Now, when I receive concerning news, I allow myself the same 3 days before determining how, or whether, to become actively involved. During this period, I remain warm and available if my child wishes to talk further, but I do not insert myself with anxious urgency before genuinely understanding the situation and considering what response, if any, would actually be helpful. I recall a specific instance when my daughter shared that she and her husband were considering a significant, somewhat risky career change. My immediate instinct, in the past, would have been to voice my concerns immediately and forcefully, potentially straining our relationship through my anxious insistence on my own perspective. Instead, I allowed myself 3 days to consider the situation fully. By the time those 3 days had passed, I found that my initial anxious concern had settled into a more balanced perspective, one that allowed me to ask thoughtful questions rather than offering anxious, immediate objections. This measured approach led to a genuinely supportive conversation, rather than the anxious confrontation that an immediate response likely would have produced. What this rule is not. I want to be clear about what this practice does not mean, because I believe misunderstanding this could lead to genuine harm in certain situations. This rule is not meant to apply to genuine emergencies, situations involving immediate safety concerns, serious health crises, or any circumstance requiring urgent action. In these genuine emergencies, immediate response is not only appropriate but necessary, and I want to be very clear that the 3-day rule applies specifically to situations involving emotional reactivity, ordinary conflicts, everyday requests, and non-urgent concerning news, not to genuine crises requiring immediate attention. I also want to clarify that this rule does not mean ignoring your child entirely during those 3 days if they need basic acknowledgement or support. I remain warm, present, and available during this period. What I withhold specifically is my significant decision or my emotionally charged response, not basic human warmth and acknowledgement of whatever they are going through. Why this rule protects your sleep specifically. I want to return to the specific benefit that gives this practice its name, because I believe this matters enormously for those of us in our later years, when genuine rest becomes increasingly important for our overall health. This rule protects your sleep because it removes the pressure to resolve every difficult situation immediately, the very pressure that once kept me awake for hours, replaying conversations and rehearsing responses long into the night. When you know, consciously, that you have deliberately committed to waiting 3 days before responding to any particular difficulty, your mind is given permission to release that situation from urgent, active processing. Rather than lying awake attempting to solve or respond to a problem immediately, you can remind yourself, calmly, that you have already made a decision about how to handle this. You will consider it thoughtfully over the coming days, not immediately, not tonight. This simple, deliberate release has been, in my own experience, remarkably effective at allowing genuine sleep to return, even on nights following significant difficulty with one of my children. Addressing the fear that waiting seems cold or dismissive, I know some of you may wonder whether waiting 3 days before responding to a difficult situation with your child might seem cold, dismissive, or uncaring. I want to address this concern honestly, because it is a legitimate consideration. I want to be clear that this practice does not mean complete silence or withdrawal during those 3 days. If my child reaches out during this period, I remain warm and responsive in ordinary ways. What I specifically withhold is my significant decision or my emotionally reactive response to whatever difficult situation has arisen, not basic warmth, acknowledgement, or ordinary communication. In my own experience, my children have not experienced this practice as cold or dismissive. If anything, they have come to appreciate that my eventual responses, offered after genuine consideration rather than immediate emotional reaction, tend to be more thoughtful, more measured, and ultimately more helpful than my previous pattern of immediate, often emotionally charged reactions. I would also gently suggest that an immediate response, offered while you yourself are still consumed by raw emotion, often serves your own need to discharge that emotion more than it genuinely serves your child's well-being. A measured response, offered after genuine reflection, tends to communicate deeper care and consideration than an immediate, emotionally reactive response ever could. What happened to my sleep and my health? I want to share honestly what happened to my own sleep and overall health after adopting this practice consistently over the past several years. The immediate, most noticeable change was in my sleep itself. Rather than losing entire nights to anxious rumination following difficult situations with my children, I found myself able to genuinely rest, even on nights following significant conflict or concerning news, because I had given myself explicit permission to postpone my response and my active processing until the following days, rather than demanding immediate resolution from my exhausted, emotionally reactive mind late at night. Beyond sleep specifically, I noticed broader improvements in my overall health and emotional stability. The chronic anxiety that had once characterized my relationship to any difficulty involving my children began to diminish significantly, replaced by a calmer, more measured approach that no longer depleted my energy and peace the way my previous pattern of immediate emotional reactivity once did. What happened to my relationships? Perhaps most significantly, my relationships with my children have genuinely improved since adopting this practice. The measured, thoughtful responses I now offer, developed over 3 days of genuine reflection rather than immediate emotional reactivity, tend to produce far more productive conversations and resolutions than my previous pattern ever did. My children, I believe, have also come to trust that my responses reflect genuine consideration rather than momentary emotional reactivity, which has, over time, deepened their trust in both my judgment and my genuine care for their well-being. My final words to you, my dear friends: if you have spent years losing sleep over difficult situations with your adult children, reacting immediately from raw emotion rather than genuine clarity, I want you to know that a simple, deliberate pause, just 3 days, can transform both your own peace and the quality of your relationships with the people you love most. You do not need to resolve every difficulty immediately. You do not need to sacrifice your own sleep and peace in service of urgent, emotionally reactive responses that rarely serve anyone well. Give yourself permission to wait, to let genuine clarity develop, before deciding how to respond to life's inevitable difficulties. Your sleep, your health, and ultimately your relationships will benefit significantly from this simple, deliberate practice. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If these words resonated with you, I hope you will consider adopting this same practice the next time a difficult situation arises with your own adult children. Give yourself 3 days. Let your emotions settle. Let genuine clarity develop. Your sanity and your relationships are worth this simple, deliberate patience. This has been Life Mastery 60+. Until next time, protect your rest, trust the clarity that time provides, and remember that the wisest response is rarely the most immediate one.